internally is stored as a JSON element. I mean, that's not obvious. But that's why we have this get value of t. If we ever change internal implementation, it would still work, right?
Yeah, interesting. So I guess the other methods you get from ilist and idictionary is all the mutation things, right? Add or remove, right? Which presumably are all public APIs, not explicitly implemented, so you can actually add a member to an array, remove a member from an array, and you know.
And that works awesome with dynamic because you know, you just call add or remove or whatever you want on it, and you know, it'll just find those methods on, you know, ilist or idictionary. If you're not using dynamic, you have to then know it's a JSON array or JSON object, you know, or cast ilist or idictionary if you want, and then call add.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess I need to think a little bit more, but like normally when you have a DOM, like there is again, I guess I have to look at sample code. Like I have a hard time seeing, because logically it seems like all the interactions are likely going through JSON node, because well, that's just the way things are, right? Because gives you the indexer for everything. And then when you want to mutate, you would have to downcast to the appropriate parent container in order to do any meaningful modifications. It also seems your DOM does not have a parent pointer, right? You can only get to children, right? But not to the parent.
Okay, I'm gonna in the chat anyway paste a link to well, I just some of the examples.
I guess my other question is, like, you have an indexer on JSON node that gives you an index, but how do I get the count? Or length, for that matter?
Well, in that particular case, you would have to cast, if you're not using dynamic, to the appropriate type. Again, the indexer was recently added based upon feedback where it was too difficult and too verbose, I guess, to navigate down a hierarchy. So
yeah, I mean, I get that. It's just like, it seems to me like if you want to enable navigation through JSON node, then like what would make sense to me is if you can generically effectively enumerate the contents of a JSON node without knowing whether it's an object or an array. But that would still require some level of, I don't know, key value, like a collection with like key value pairs, or the actual keys you can pass in. I mean, I guess for keys I can kind of buy that the idea is you know it already, so you pass in name or first name. But for an array, it seems weird that you know the dimensions up front. Like, I mean, most of the time I would think an array is unbounded, so you would think it can have n number of elements, and I have no idea how many elements it has in practice. Versus for the key values, it's like, well, this is my schema, so I expect them to have a first name, a last name, and an address property, right? But for the array, I would think a length would be probably necessary if you want to make that useful.
Okay, if you want to scroll down to the next section, I think I have some examples.
Oopsie, yeah.
Yeah, it's just showing very short samples on how to call serialize. Nothing too surprising here. However, this section is there because there is a serialized method added to JSON node that is a helper. And so I have equivalent longer versions here, like if you didn't have this helper, what you would do. So I'm proposing that for the simple cases anyway, that we add some serialized and a static deserialized method as helpers.
Yeah, I don't have super strong opinions. I just have this gut feel, as I said earlier. Like, to me, it seems a bit weird that the DOM holds onto serializer options and, you know, implements effectively serialization itself. That seems surprising to me. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just what I would not intuitively expect. I would expect the serializer to be kind of like, kind of like a higher level, if you will, over the DOM, so that the serializer is aware of the DOM and like will do the right thing when you serialize the JSON object or you deserialize the JSON object. But I would probably not expect to find a serialize method on the objects or the options. But I'm not saying that's wrong.
Completely optional. It was just a proposal to simplify these common scenarios. But
yeah, as I said earlier, like I would probably expect like a parse or a load method or something to the extent on as a static method on JSON node or JSON object or whatever the corresponding API is, and then get back the DOM from there.
Instead of the deserialize, you mean, or something in a
No, I think you want serialization support. I mean, like if you serialize the DOM, you would expect that to go out as JSON, right? So I think the serializer would have to special case the DOM no matter what. But I would say as the entry point, I find it weird to deserialize as the only way to get the DOM.
The parse method that you're referring to, would that?
Like also maybe I'm wrong. I just think it's cheaper. That might also not be true, but like it seems to me like, you know, the JSON is just, you know, effectively just parsing, or the DOM is just parsing, right? So it's just basically going through the reader and then constructs objects as it does it, which is like I would think much cheaper than going through serialization.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, definitely. The JSON element and JSON document types already have parse methods, and there's a lot of them. There's like dozens of them, or at least a dozen. And it's possible, to use those and then pass that in as the value if you want. I don't think I show any examples of that. Whether we want to have, mirror those parse methods on this type, I'm completely open to that. This just shows maybe the more simpler model where you, simpler in the terms of keeping the API as small as possible.
Right.
That they're not there.
Yeah, I guess a very common example where you wouldn't call serialize directly would be you have, let's say your actual object like customer or whatever, and then you have this, JSON object directly on the customer as here's my fallback for all the other JSON stuff I don't want to talk about in my API. And you would expect that to work properly, right? So in this case, people wouldn't directly call serialize of JSON object. They would just implicitly deserialize it because it's part of their API, right? Or part of their data content, whatever you want to call this, right? And so in that sense, yeah, no, it totally makes sense that the serializer is aware of it.
Okay, if you scroll down, this talks a little bit about get value. You can specify T. Cast operators. This section is just saying, based upon discussion, that we're not going to add any cast operators by default. I mean, the client of record. And I have some rationale for that.
I think that makes sense. I mean, you would get it when you use dynamic, right? But outside of dynamic, I think my expectation would be that, I mean, an explicit cast maybe, but an implicit cast for sure not.
Yeah, and this is then different than other implementations that have casts. And of course, you can only have the implicit and explicit casts if you know what the other type is, right? And since this type supports, or since this programming model supports custom converters where you can bring your own type and your own conversion, it wouldn't work with any of those.
Right. Yeah, I think.
But if you don't care about the performance hit from dynamic, the large assembly and the runtime performance, you pretty much you can do whatever you want at runtime regarding casting. I mean, as long as basically as long as C# understands the type that you're trying to convert to, either because the variable is of a certain type or you add an explicit cast, then it'll just do that for you.
Yeah, I think it has been a while, but I think last time I looked at JSON.NET, I believe the DOM supports explicit cast, so you can effectively fish out a string or an int directly by just casting. That is not, I would say, intuitive, but looking at the API, so I think it's always good to have a get value of t method so that you, or I think he calls it value of t or whatever, but like basically a strongly typed API to get that. But once I saw a sample code where he did explicit cast, it was actually somewhat readable. It looked somewhat better than the get value in between. So it's what I'm saying. I think I'm personally open to explicit cast because they still occur and the failure points are clear in your code. But yeah, implicit cast seem very bad. The only thing I'm not sure of, because I don't understand necessarily like what that means, is the idea that you can cast to custom types, because it seems, again, maybe just I'm weird, but like it seems odd to me that I can navigate the DOM, and as I'm doing that also deserialize into my custom types. That seems, I guess, surprising to me. But
I mean, that would only work if you use dynamic or wrote a cast operator on your custom type to go to or from JSON node. Otherwise, the language would say it doesn't understand what to do with this.
Yeah, I mean, Steve listed it under non-dynamic, right? So like if you do this here, doesn't that effectively do something that basically just does deserialization?
I don't see how that would compile. I guess if value returns object, but then it's still going to do just a runtime cast. It's not going to do a dispatch or a change type or anything.
Right.
So
yeah, I guess that depends on the behavior of value. I think I asked that earlier, and I think Steve said something to the extent of like, no, value can totally return your custom type because you're standing on the serialization option, so it can deserialize.
I think the way I have it here is that JSON array of subindex 1 or index 1 here, you're creating the JSON value of a custom data type. And then when you're accessing that in the line highlighted, you're asking for the raw value, right? Not the JSON
you're just
value.
Getting back the one from the assignment.
Yeah.
So because it was a list of object, so you're getting back that object. But if you deserialize this, then it's just nonsense, and that would never work. But that would depend on if JSON array
that's what the comment
did new on the indexer to turn it back into an object returning one instead of a JSON node one.
Right. So the next line that says or to support a possible conversion is a call to get value where you specify the t. Assuming that the value is convertible, then you, instead of a cast, which would only compile, or at runtime it only work if you specify the actual type, the get value would support a conversion in theory. The next, basically the next line of code that you have highlighted.
Right.
So it's kind of like an explicit cast, but it's not. I mean, because it it actually will, it might have to call a custom converter and do some other hoops to get that value.
Yeah, I guess I would generally expect explicit cast only for like primitive types, right? Like things that are basically part of the JSON schema, right? Strings, ints, floats. doubles, right? Things that we have intrinsic understanding for. Everything else would be, yeah, you have to call get value with your custom T if there's a custom converter behind it. That seems fine.
Yeah, so this example with the cast that you've highlighted is probably not the greatest example because it wasn't intended to show something that we're doing. It just kind of comes for free.
Right.
I mean, there's no explicit cast.
Well, I mean, so is your intention that JSON array, the indexer that it exposes, is it returning JSON node or is it returning object? Because the base class has a JSON node one, so you have to decide if you're using new and implicit binding for the interface, or if you're doing explicit and letting the JSON nodeness lift up.
For which line?
So the my custom data type v1 equal cast of jarray1 subvalue is the indexer exposed off of JSON array without going through ilist. Is it the ilist one or is it the JSON node one? You have conflicting indexers, so only one of them can be the public one.
Right. I believe that this will call the indexer on, well, let me see, JSON value. No, it's because it's
because ilist of object says you have to have an indexer that returns object, and JSON node says you have an indexer that returns JSON node. So only one of those two can be the public indexer if your concrete type is JSON array. And I can't tell which one you intended it to be.
I mean, I would generally say like it needs to be the one from the base, because otherwise this guy is only useful for one hop, right? If you want to do JSON array of 1 and then, oh, that's an object now and I want to access the first name property, you would expect us to write JArray of 1 and then of first name, right? And so that doesn't.
And
work
in that
if you get
case,
back object.
In that case, the line with the hard cast would not compile, because you would have a JSON node, or I guess, sorry, JArray sub 1 would be JSON node. Then you get back the value. Value is, I think, also JSON node.
Right.
No, value is the object.
Okay.
So it'll just return the internal object. I mean, we can change the name to internal value, or if we wanted to do something to make it more clear. Like
no, that's fine. I remembered value being another JSON node because
yeah,
that would, I guess.
So value won't do any conversions. It just returns, hey, whatever I'm wrapping, return it. And then if you want a possible conversion, you call get value on it with up T.
Yeah, I guess. I think this is the thing that confuses me. It's like it's a bit weird to me, and I haven't really thought about this in great detail. So like, I'm not saying the API is problematic. I just don't have it in my head that when you look at a DOM, that that there's a value property that is basically unbounded, and the customer can put whatever they want into it. But I guess that's the behavior you have, right? Value is just a pure storage for you of type object, right?
Yeah, and part of this again is influenced by the dynamic support, where the value is determined basically at runtime, not necessarily known at compile time. I mean, for example, you can have custom converters registered dynamically, which may cause issues even with non-dynamic support if you mix and match, the T value with the incorrect custom converters, or with incorrect JSON, or the internal value.
Right. I mean, do you know what JSON.NET does? Like, does JSON.NET's DOM have access to the converters? Or is that something that you just have to pass in?
I'm pretty sure they will not. I'm pretty sure that it does not work that way in Newtonsoft.
Yeah, again, like to me, like what I would intuitively understand with the DOM is, I would say it seems fine to have conversions, but I would say to me they only make sense for the primitives, like basically, or like intrinsic understood types. I mean, they don't have to be primitives in the JSON sense, but like I think it makes sense to say you can pass this JSON string as a datetime because we happen to understand datetimes, or booleans, or GUIDs, or some other type that we think are common enough. But like, it seems a bit weird to me that you can say, give me this JSON value and now convert it to, my custom data type. And when I'm doing that, then, it may call through some JSON converter. That seems a bit like, to me, that's kind of, at that point, you kind of blend the world between the DOM and the serializer to the point where I can't differentiate them anymore. And that seems, I think that's kind of where my mental struggle is, because if you only think of read, I can kind of understand that. But as soon as you think of read and write, I have a hard time understanding what the semantics now are when you put stuff back, because it seems like, you can corner yourselves in weird ways where the structure of the DOM and the structure of my objects don't match anymore, right? And now I have some weird inconsistent state that I don't know how to reason about anymore.
I hear what you're saying again. It all comes back to, again, the dynamic support is like that, right? And you definitely might want to have a custom data type work with dynamic without going through extra,
I guess that depends on what you mean by dynamic, right? I mean, I would think, to me, the dynamic support would be based off of the schema. So like, I would generally expect when I do dynamic, like I can access the thing as it is in the structure of the JSON document. So I can say dot first name, dot last name, or whatever the property names in the underlying JSON are, right? I would not expect to say, dot whatever, and then the property names now become whatever my properties are in the corresponding schema that I happen to have in terms of custom objects, right? Does that make sense? Like, I mean, to me, the dynamic is just a glorified way to avoid the string-based indexers and casting, right?
Well, it's trying to equalize the playing field for intrinsic types and custom data types in this design, right? Instead of hard coding only types that we know about, it's saying, we have this options class. It knows about all your custom data types. You don't have to know, okay, you might not even know what if you have a custom converter. I mean, if you have a custom converter for time span,
right,
and which stored as a string, say in JSON, with the proposal here, forget about the non-dynamic for a minute. But with dynamic, you just go time span, time equals whatever the value, and it'll just work. And if you didn't have that, you would have to know, okay, time span is not supported internally. I need to now call a different method, maybe some sort of deserialized method or helper method. I'm not sure, but then the intent was to equal the playing field between custom data types and internal types. And also we have a bunch of internal custom converters on the serializer that we continuously add. For example, that do not work in JSON document and JSON element, because JSON document, JSON element don't understand custom converters or the serializer in general.
Right.
So there's a ton of types, including custom collection types, and even things like enums that just won't work unless you know about the custom converters.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Although, like, yeah, maybe. As I said, I have not spent any time thinking about this.
Yeah. I mean, this was intended for discussion. This meeting before we create, the official API. We might have to have another round discussion. Definitely need to clean this up and to reflect the existing prototype and some feedback here. But this is the first wave, so it's good to have these discussions.
Yeah, you just got a gut feel, right? So like, I spent the last hour thinking about this for the first time, right? So don't read too much into what I'm saying. I'm just saying my gut feel reaction is X, and that might be as wrong as they come, right? So, yeah, should we go further, or is that enough for now?
This section is not important. It's just some ways to simplify the API with the options. So yes, keep scrolling here. Let's just kind of get to the end, and I think we can skip that. We're talking about indexers here. Yeah, here's an example of.
Yeah, that's what I meant earlier. Yeah.
Without that, the example below is what we had previously in the previous iteration. Something like the below. It's like, okay.
I mean, that seems completely reasonable to me. Like.
Yeah. So this feedback here was from the Azure team that they wanted a small terse syntax, which they have in their prototype.
Right.
And they probably wouldn't recommend using ours if we didn't have it.
Yeah, I mean, like that. I mean, between these two, it's kind of obvious that you want this one. That's why I said earlier, like I understand why you want navigation on the base. I guess this is an example where you don't have to know the length, right? Because if I know basically assign into the array, 25, it just means that you effectively fill in, I don't know, 23 elements with zeros, right? Or nulls. So makes sense.
Yeah, scroll a little bit more, getting close to the end here. Just to kind of cover everything really quick here. Yeah, this is just saying, hey, if you want to change if you don't want to use JSON element, JSON node, we'll provide a way for you to use these writable DOM types instead of JSON element.
So,
for example, for the overflow bucket we have for extra properties that don't map to any CLR, we put those in a dictionary, and that's shown below here. String comma JSON element or string comma object dictionary, and now you'd be able to specify string JSON node or just have object be JSON node instead of JSON element.
that seems a bit weird to me, to be honest, because if I call enable dynamic types, I only have the behavior if I say object that you give me back JSON node, right? Rather than JSON element.
Instead of JSON element.
Yeah. So I think it seems to me like if you call enable dynamic types, I would argue it should always imply use JSON node for unknown types. I think I would not have the middle ground where if you say deserialize of object, you get back JSON node, but if you have overflow, we still give you back JSON element. That seems weird to me.
It could perhaps break some code if you didn't have this option.
Well, but I mean, they will already break the code anyway, right? Because if you say enable dynamic types, you change what object does, right?
But you could have the mode where you want to support, where you don't want to enable dynamic. So yeah. So you're talking about if you actually call the method to enable it, we just do this automatically. Okay, fine. This is more, I think, makes more sense when you don't enable dynamic.
Oh, okay, that one I understand now. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Because this is a common scenario. I don't think it's covered here, but it's a scenario where you have this overflow dictionary, which is kind of cool, that we create this dictionary of your missing properties. Yeah. However, that's kind of immutable. In order to change a value, you have to remove an item from the dictionary, and then add it again, or overwrite the value of that particular dictionary element, and that's just not very, I guess, intuitive. So it would really help with mutable DOM for overflow properties. Or basically, if you just want to change the value of a type being returned from system object, you can't do that today,
right?
Because you get JSON element back, and it's like, how do you change it? You can't. You have to create another one, and how do you create another one? Well, it's complicated. You have to have JSON and parse it. So it'll help with a lot of edge case scenarios.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, using this without enable dynamic types, I think I agree, is probably very common.
The missing versus null, if we're ready to move forward to that, this was also based upon some feedback from previous mini review. Normally, this is saying that we're returning null instead of some other missing property, like JSON element actually, I believe, has a missing. How does that work? Yeah, Jeremy, are you there? What is JSON element? Does it have support for missing? No. If you ask for a property that's not there, I think it'll throw, I believe.
That's my recollection, yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to differentiate between missing and null, there are ways to do that, and that's what this example here with try get value is doing. If you really care about, hey, was this property in the JSON or not, you can still figure that out, but the default is that it will just be null.
JSON element is a struct, right?
Yes, that's why.
Yes.
Yeah, they have this missing.
Yeah, I think for DOM, I think null makes more sense to me than throwing.
Dynamic by default should have null semantics, so this kind of aligns with that. We did get some feedback on this early on that it is expected to return null instead of throw because the type expando object throws if you access a property that's not there, which is kind of counterintuitive because in JSON you may or may not know because the JSON might not just include it if it's not there. So a lot of people do not like expando object when it comes to processing JSON because of that semantics. And today it's not possible to change.
Right.
In either case, we're not using expando object, but that was a discussion that we had around issues with dynamic object. Okay, so the rest I think is examples. There might be some issues or something. I'm not sure at the end, but
I mean, I'll say that this reads fairly nicely. The only thing that's slightly sad is that people have to know that they have to instantiate the dynamic versions of those objects. But I guess that's the way it is.
What does myArray.myObject mean?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too.
I guess if there's an index I'm missing.
Well, but arrays don't have named indexers unless that is doing what Java script would actually do and convert it into an associative array where the indexes now become keys.
No, I think the idea is that these guys here, there's a bracket 2 missing or bracket 1 missing.
yeah, sorry, I'll note that. I'll look at also the code examples and synchronize them between this here.
You also have some JSON dynamic object and dynamic JSON object kind of thing. Big one. Yeah, makes sense. And then these are just the converters directly, right? Or the conversions. Yeah. Right.
This is an example, this converter to say, hey, I want to construct my own type, and in order to do that, I might need to call a constructor. And to call a constructor, I need one of the JSON values. So this is just say, hey, I mean, this is not going to be the most performant thing in the world, but it says deserialize it as dynamic, as a temporary value, and then new up the real POCOs, the strongly typed version using the state from that. It's just kind of one example that dynamic could be used in scenarios today that is very difficult to do. Well, it's not very difficult. Basically, instead of this, you would just use JSON element and do some more work, but this is a little cleaner. Okay, I think there's just a couple of things at the bottom, but like I said, all of the examples that I have in the tests in this private branch, work, and there might be some mismatches here from the document, but I would kind of use the tests as some of the examples, and I'll make sure that this is updated to reflect the current support. You have notes though, Emu, so I'll add those notes to here.
Yeah, I did not a good job keeping notes, but I will write some up afterwards. Yeah, unless there's more, I think that probably the next step would be that you send out an API review for the whole surface area, and then we can probably drill in a bit more. Unless Jeremy has other ideas.
Jeremy has no ideas.
And I pull the branch and play around with the code. I'd recommend it to get a feel for the current proposal here. There are some questions, with the API in general, but I do think that this design meets the requirements for the Azure team, which I didn't originally have. And that's to be able to navigate quickly down without using the dynamic support. So, given that, I think the high level programming model, has to have a node class, and then a collection of, pretty much what I have on here, with some indexers at the top. Newtonsoft has the same. So I think at the highest level, the API for navigation is correct. I know there's lots of issues around get value and then the value property that returns the internal value. So I think I'll spend some time documenting that and make sure that we can discuss it next time.
Sounds good. All right, then I think let's use the remaining 35 minutes to go over some more issues then. So I will respond with notes to the PR of what I just said, but I will do it after this meeting because I still have to write them because I was just too busy listening to you and not actually typing anything. All right, is Eric on the call by any chance?
Yep, I'm here.
Perfect.
Okay. We did talk a bit about this issue in the previous meeting. Should I just take it from the top?
Yes, because I don't think I
Okay.
remember anything.
You weren't
Okay,
there
sure.
yet.
Oh, okay.
that's
So
probably why.
basically, this is a community request to basically add support for index and range types for Innumerable. While it's not necessarily a construct that is compatible with Innumerable, I kind of see why people might want to use this for certain use cases. So the proposal basically involves providing an overload for element that accepts an index parameter, as well as a slicing construct that accepts ranges. Obviously, this won't be very performant because supporting this for arbitrary indices and ranges typically means that you might want to consume ON space.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, it should provide a sort of convenience methods for certain applications like testing, etc.
If you specify an offset from the end,
Mm-hmm.
this will have to, at runtime, just read through the entire thing and buffer that many spots.
Exactly. So if you do like a hat k element that operation, it would mean that you would need to keep the last k elements as you enumerate through the enumerable.
Right, which is not that bad, right? I mean, it's like it's as good as you can make it, right?
Yeah,
you would
unless
you would actually need to potentially keep track of n elements, where n is the entire length of the enumeration.
No, you would only need K. Do it with a linked list, so you can.
No,
do
so
circular
here's an
rotation.
example. So here's an example. You have Innumerable of t, and you index on 1 ... 1 billion.
Well,
Like-
that's slicing. We're talking about element
Oh,
add.
talking about, okay, yes, talking about indexing, yes.
Slicing, I think we're going to reject, but we'll
Okay.
get there.
Okay, sorry, I jumped ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for small values like 5, it probably doesn't matter, but it seems like this is going to be some performance pitfall that someone finds in their code when they start using a weird offset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I guess the answer that I have here is that the existing element add overload isn't very performant in the first place because you have to iterate through like k elements. So, this overload is worse in certain cases, but it still sort of seems to be acceptable for what this particular method is doing already, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like to me, element add or similar APIs on Linq, they're really not meant for performance, right? I think they're very useful when you know, in the debugger or when you're like in a workbook or something, you want to just like, quickly look at the thing without like doing some, weird things because it's hard to write code in the debugger in that sense, right? But if you do index-based arithmetic over an Innumerable, like you're in deep trouble, right? So you would normally like rewrite your algorithm in such a way you don't need that. But I don't know. To me, the Linq APIs, they're just great for exploration of like things you happen to have in memory, right? And if you have 1 billion elements in memory, then yeah, I think you already pay the penalty for that, right? So it shouldn't be like terribly surprising that this doesn't perform very well.
You said we're talking about this in terms of like exploring data and testing scenarios and basically non-production scenarios as far as I can tell. I got to wonder, if I was writing this code that wanted to do this, I think I'd kind of just do to-array. So, you know what I mean? Rather than deal with it as an enumerable, I just say, hey, I got a bunch of crap, just do .to-array, and then deal with it as an array, which is much easier to deal with.
I mean, that's true of almost anything that you do two Linq operations on, right? You want to know that it's in a good concrete type, and that Linq members are good for prototyping and for you did a thing at most once.
Yeah.
Yeah, although one of the nice things about Linq operators in general is I can string them together without getting to an array in the middle, right? So I can say .where, .select, whatever. And then at the end I can say .to-array, dump it into an array, and do whatever I want with it.
Yeah. That is
I mean, obviously it depends on the use case. Like if you just need to read sort of the last element in a sequence, why convert it into array in the first place? But I agree with your point in general. It just feels like it might be useful for certain cases, and because apparently users want to use indices and ranges in Innumerable as well. Obviously, given that we added to the public API, there is potential for abuse. But
does Linq have an existing last operator, like last or default?
It does, yeah.
Oh, it does. Okay.
If you want just the last element, it's easy, right? If you want to add the last 5, then we don't have that today.
Yeah, because last is you have to store one thing and just override it every walk through the loop.
Yeah, the closest thing we have today, if you want the last 5 elements, and Steve Toe pointed this out the other day, is you can call take last 5, but it's not guaranteed to actually give you 5 elements. It will give you up to 5 elements. So it does have slightly different semantics than what we're discussing.
Interesting. So it's take last. Didn't even know we had that. But like, what is?
Yeah. So last will give you. So last will give you the actual last element, unless the enumerable is empty, in which case it will throw.
Right.
Take last says it's basically take, but in reverse, effectively. So it says give me as many elements from the end of the enumeration as you can, up to some maximum number, and the result could be an empty enumeration if the input was also empty.
I see, but it's well defined, as in like if you have 5 elements or more, then last 5 will give me 5. It's not this. Well, I didn't feel like it. We're going to give you 3.
So the last API will give you only the last element as a standalone value. If the underlying enumeration is empty, it will throw an exception. Take last gives you up to the whatever count you specify.
And if you specify 1 billion, then it will buffer 1 billion elements?
If your enumeration is at large, yes.
So that
That makes me kind of want to do these. That seems pretty. I mean, the fact that we have those things seems pretty similar to both element at and slice.
Yeah, I think the only benefit
Agreed.
to support element add is that basically people can just have a single data type that happens to have language support, right? The implementation would be trivial, right? You would just say if from end, then call take last, right?
Yep.
And then just check that the result is, actually these elements, and if not, you throw and say, sorry, there were not enough elements, right?
Yeah, looks like take last iterator is just Q of T. Yeah. When it's too full, it does DQ NQ, DQ NQ to maintain the right length.
Are we going to optimize these for?
for inefficient things? I guess I'm more comfortable.
Yeah,
with
we should optimize them for I collection and I read-only collection.
Yep.
Yeah.
Probably I list rather than I collection.
Is I collection not indexable?
I don't think it is. I think it just
not
has.
necessarily.
Okay,
It
then-
only
then
has
yeah, I
length, I
list.
think, or count, I should say.
Okay, I list then. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So for plain I enumerables, would slice ever perform worse?
We're not,
like the way
we're not
we
talking
did
about
for
slice yet.
Okay.
So like for element
Yeah,
add,
okay,
so
element out right now.
So is anybody opposed to element add?
It seems fine to me. The perf is going to be exactly as bad as you want it to be. If you use caret, we can do a fast thing on indexable types and a very, very slow and expensive thing on large caret numbers on large enumerables. But
Right.
it's Linq. Sometimes things are ridiculously expensive and sometimes they're O1.
Right.
So we would document that element at might take, so an element at from the front would be exactly the same performance that the existing element at has. Element at from the end would take potentially O of n memory and O of n runtime, where n is the length of the enumeration, potentially.
Well, it would O of k memory, where k is
The index.
the
Well,
index
K is
value.
bounded by the size of the collection, so that would be O of n. It would be
Fair.
theta of K and O of n.
Fair enough.
Well, do we document the weird memory usage of take last and group by?
Well, take last is as big as the thing that you ask for, or
Right.
up to as big as the thing as you ask for. So that one's easy. You understand it.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's
well,
the element that sometimes needs to do take last, and sometimes, it needs to do better than take last, but it
but
effectively does take last if it can't figure out any better option.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but I think like in terms of memory, it would never be bounded by the size of the collection. It would be bounded by, how much do you want from the end, right? Because that's how much you have to buffer.
Yeah. I guess sane users of this method would use like a caret of a literal value, and there wouldn't be many surprises.
Yeah, it does seem. I can understand somebody saying they want like the 5th from last. It seems weird you'd want the 10,000th from last, but I
But
don't
we
think
can't
that's-
tell at runtime though, that's the thing.
Sure.
Right, but like it still means the space is O(n), where n is the index, not O(n), where n is the length of the enumerable, right? So it's still fairly well bounded by arguments the person actually passes in at the call side rather
Well,
than.
it will always have to do for a non-indexable enumerable. It will have to walk literally every element in the collection to figure out where the end was to know where 5 ago was.
Right.
So it's always going to be O(n) of the collection in time, and then in space, it's O of the value you passed in, which, as Eric pointed out, is of the same power and maximum value as the length of the collection. So it's O(n) memory and O(n).
Sure, fair.
So that in practice could be much, much smaller. Probably often is much, much smaller.
Right.
Yeah, I guess.
So
yeah,
It's weird to start asking for like the 77th element from the end, right? first, sure. The second, third, fourth, fifth, yeah, all right. But like once you get past a relatively small number, unless you're doing something like trying to iterate from the end, that's probably.
Yeah, I
Right.
think in practice these will be things people use in the debugger where they just poke at the last n elements, right? And yeah, as you said, it will be whatever, the last, the second to last, the third from last, and that's probably where that ends, right? I don't think people will actually try to, as you said, like the 17,000th element from the end seems very unlikely.
Yes, the degenerate case would be that somebody is naively writing reverse, and they have an incrementing loop or to do negative indexes until this method throws. Yeah, that took n squared time and space, but
Good job.
called .reverse. We have a thing for that.
What's the behavior of element at _5 when the length of the enumerable is over 4 billion elements?
Same as 2array. Like
That wouldn't matter.
it's you can't do that.
In the implementation in my head, you would do something like take last node, where you just use a queue. You would never have let it exceed whatever the passed in index value is. So once you hit if you asked for _5, once you hit 5, you're doing dq, dropping it to 4 in queue to get the most recent one, and then now you do the weird queue lets me peek at the elements under the covers and go take. Actually, at that point, it would just be return q.dq. So it's already in the right position.
So it should work just fine, Tanner, because we don't care about the length. We never store that amount in memory.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the only issue is if the index is caret of a value that's passed as an argument into a service.
Right, but don't do that.
I mean, that's no different than take last of a user provided value, and well, you're just burning memory at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, there's worse things you can do, right? Accept a regex as an argument. I mean, there's many ways we can allow you to DOS your own service. How many GCs do you want to run on the service, right? Like there are creative ways.
Eric, have we looked at all the other Linq things that might take offsets and indexes to see if we can upgrade more than these APIs?
So there were a few other methods proposed in this issue, but we kind of decided to axe those because of issues and just focus on these two because they are relatively unambiguous in terms of how they should be implemented. But I definitely think there's opportunity to expand in the future.
So what's wrong with element at or default? That seems fairly mundane as well.
So I think the poster actually should have included element at or default as well. There wasn't anything controversial about that or overload, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, technically, we haven't looked at the proposed APIs yet.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the screen.
Fair enough. Let's do that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so here we go. So then, yeah, the first two seem fine based on our conversation, right? And then we can now argue over slice.
Right. So for slice and the implicit indexer that uses system.range, what we have said in the guidelines is do return the declaring type from an indexer that accepts system.range. We can't do that with this.
Sorry, say this again. Do return the declaring.
So the range-based indexer on an array returns an array. It doesn't return a slice.
Right.
So if you pass in Levi's custom collection of T, this slice method should give back an instance of Levi's custom collection of T. That's not guaranteed possible, which means we can't add this. We would need to call it something other than slice and not support the range-based indexers.
But the user's not passing in a custom type. They're passing in an IEnumerable of T, and we are returning an IEnumerable of T.
Yeah,
it's what Jeremy meant to say is that our slice methods return the actual type, not the type that the compiler thinks a local is. And we can't return a type whose actual type, or we can't return an object whose actual type is IEnumerable because it's an interface.
Why does it have to match though? it's taking an IEnumerable and it's returning an IEnumerable. So I think it still meets the original contract requirement.
Well, I mean,
It's
technically
just what we've
declaring
done for
type
all
here
other
is
APIs.
enumerable because we didn't write it ever thinking anyone would ever try and do it with an extension method. But but taking what we meant with the thing of matches the input type.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, Jeremy. At the same time, though, I would argue that this is kind of how all the Linq methods work, for better or worse, right? I mean, we had the same discussion on string, where certain APIs appear on string and they are confusing. I forgot which one it is. There was one that always happens. I think it's one of the contains overloads that didn't exist on string, and they go through the Linq bullshit. And like that's, I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't think that's terrible, because I mean, it's not that we don't have another option, because realistically, I think this method is super useful in an IEnumerable, and it seems weird to block that, because realistically, if your type actually supports slicing, you can just add a static method on your type that does whatever you want it to do, right? So if you don't, then you don't, and then you get the shitty Linq implementation. And if you do have a better API for that, well, then it hides the Linq implementation. So this doesn't really prevent you from supporting slicing in a sensible way. It's just you have a fallback mechanism to say anything that is IEnumerable, there's a default slice implementation that might not be great, but like it's probably decent enough unless you care, right, about performance.
But the only way we could find if you have other slice implementations is to do reflection. Like this there's nothing optimal it could do aside from special casing, specifically list of T in array.
No, it would be statically, right? Like you would say, like, string supports slicing, right? So the fact that that string is IEnumerable of char, it just means the implementation that we have on string hides this one, right? That's realistically what happens, right? So like you have a compile time polymorphism, if you will, right? Like at runtime, I would
using but if they had the thing non-statically typed as the input type, because they already had it as another IEnumerable, then there is going to be a change of the shape of data. And yes, that happens with all the Linq things, but it does mean that this method does give up on performance characteristics. Like I feel like some of the Linq methods are, if a countable thing went in, a countable thing comes back out, and it can to make further queries fast.
Right.
But in this one, it's this loses all notion of countability. This is, if you hit this, it's garbage.
Yeah, to be clear, like I'm not saying necessarily like, like if we feel strongly about the semantics of a method called slice, I would just name it differently. I mean, I think it's also reasonable to just take this, rename this API to take, because that's probably more in the spirit of Linq anyway.
If it's take range and we don't add the square bracket support, that's fine. The trouble is, if we do add this, it means that all collection types now support the square bracket notation, and no one can reason about what the result is.
Actually,
for what it's worth, there has been an alternative name proposed in the issue. So if you scroll down a bit, you'll see that one alternative name was called elements in.
I'd call it take range because it matches the existing take and take last. But
yeah, I would probably call it like something take, yeah.
But
or take something. I mean,
yeah, like to me, it feels like the notion of letting this happen as a fallback on all enumerable types means that we have completely lost the goal that we had with the square bracket with range. Like, what it means, and if you have an expensive type like an array, it's an expensive operation, and if you have a cheap type like span, it's a cheap operation.
So
and
if there
this would completely take that away.
Yeah, so if there is an extension method called slice, does the compile allow it to use the bracket syntax even if it's on an interface? I don't think it does, right? So like, I guess my question is, if we rename this, are we losing any syntactic sugar? I don't think so. I don't think you get to use brackets on IEnumerable with that extension method anyways.
If it won't find it on extension methods, then we could call it this, except if they add it in the future, then we've lost. So I think that we want a name that's not slice. I'm not objecting to the concept. I'm objecting to using the word slice.
Yeah, I think I can live with that. Like, to me, I'm honestly, like, I probably wouldn't even look for slice. because I would probably just look at take, would be my guess. Like,
yeah, I mean, we can even just call it .range. That takes a range like that.
There's already a static method called
range takes range. Like numbers.
Oh, right. That's I want you to give me back like 5 through 15, skipping 7.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, to me,
So,
take range is
this-
fine. Just take as an overload is also fine because I think it's unambiguous as well. But like, I think something prefixed with take, I think, is probably a good name for the method.
So in my mind, slice, it doesn't, it requires that amount of data to be in the source, whereas take will give you fewer elements, right?
You're right. Take is basically up to. That's fair. Yep.
Yeah, so we'd be changing this slightly if we called it take.
Yeah.
Or we just say we fail if it's not actually that range, right? I mean, it also doesn't seem like a terrible
Well,
thing.
I mean, we want to be consistent with the other range-based stuff in Linq, right?
I mean, this one would be weird because if you call this method with 5..caret27, like we now have to count to figure out that caret 27 was below 5, which is negative slicing, and then that would have to throw. Like, so there's definitely, once range is involved, the notion that, I'm sorry, your end, your combination of begin and end made no sense for your data. So I don't think that saying that this take can't return less than the fully expressed range on that is bad.
Yeah, I guess it
Is
depends
that how
on.
it works today? Sorry.
If you call array.slice with where the end argument ends up being before the start argument, that'll throw.
Yeah, but if I call skip today, I say skip 10, and the enumerable only has 9 elements. What happens?
You get an empty enumerable.
Yeah.
Right, but you're not doing. I guess yes. It's if we think that it's skip and take, or skip and take last, depending on where the other one ended, then that would allow it to go empty. The question is, do you want that when you computed the end index and it ended up being nonsense?
Right.
When you do it as separate operations, you can debug it and figure out, oh, this is where it went wrong.
And would that work for all forms of range? Like, say I said, from 5 to beginning to 5 to end, give me everything there, but there's, what, four items? Then it's different from just calling skip and take last.
Well, because skip would skip the whole thing.
Right.
You'd get back assuming that it doesn't throw, you would get back the empty enumerable, and then you would call take, and that would give you back the empty enumerable. Sorry, take last. So you would get back nothing.
Yeah. So if we
I don't. Yeah, that's weird to me.
If we name this take, and it was suddenly validating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we call it take and it does what take would do, whether it's then sure.
I mean, regardless of what we call it, it would be a lazy operation, and unlike the existing slice implementations that are doing like eager copying, I think, returning an empty enumerable if the ranges don't match exactly, I think that is to be expected.
Right. Well, again, and that comes back to the weirdness with using the word slice, because that is not what slice means anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's start differently. What semantics do we want for this, right? If we want the semantics that take has, then I think calling it take or some version of take, right, take or take range, makes sense, right? If we want the semantics that slice has, which is kind of, you need to be at least those numbers of elements or we throw, then arguably take is a bad name, right? So I think I would turn it around and say what semantics do you want for this method, and then we can pick the name that makes sense for it. I think personally, the semantics of take might make more sense because the way I think about this API is that I would use it exploratory, right? And so if I'm off by one one way or the other, I probably don't care, right? But if I actually want to get back effectively something that has the right size, then well, then I totally care when I'm off by 1, and I don't want to now have an array that is like 4 short or something, right? And so I guess it kind of boils down to what you want from this method.
Why don't we have these take methods on array and string? Right? Like we've did all this work for index and range for array and string, and we had the slice semantics, right? Because that's important, because that's what people want. I would assume the exact same reasoning applies here. It's just I don't have a string or an array. I just have an IEnumerable. So why wouldn't I want those semantics?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on how you view the original, right? Because if you talk about a string or an array, like they are fixed size, right? You know exactly how many elements are in there, right? Versus an IEnumerable is a sequence. So I think because of that mindset, I think you very often want to not have exact semantics, but you want take up to and then see how far we get, or skip up to and then we see how far we get, right? So that's why I think like Innumerable always had the loose semantics of saying you provide a minimum or a maximum, versus on string and array it's always like, no, this is a fixed size buffer, so you better know exactly what your boundaries are. And so I'm not sure that's by design. I think that's just where we came from.
Given that IEnumerable is lazy, it also means that you might evaluate this at a later stage when the size is different, or you might evaluate it multiple times. And I should also add, I personally sort of lean towards adopting take semantics, primarily because there is nothing unsound about returning an empty IEnumerable or an IEnumerable that has fewer elements than what is specified in the range argument, because it's basically like set theoretic semantics. So, you could just adopt that approach without any real issues, in my opinion. The only issue, of course, is consistency with the slice implementations in the other concrete types. But if we name it something different, that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm leaning towards take as well, or the take semantics, because it seems more useful in practice. And to what Eric said, like on arrays, I've often used skip and take for that reason, because they are all implicitly IEnumerable, right? So I could use the enumerable APIs on it. On string, it's weird because you get an IEnumerable of char, which is usually not what you want.
Yeah. What are the listed use cases for this slice? Like, we normally have like, here's what I would normally want to do.
I mean, I've often used skip followed by take, which is kind of what this thing would do, right, as a shortcut.
Oh, are they not in the issue? Or is your screen frozen?
Sorry, no, I'm saying like the existing skip and take methods, I've often used them in combination. I started with skip and then take. And so to me, this take range would just allow me to do this in one line rather than 2 lines, right? So that's why I'm leaning towards the take semantics. But that's my opinion on how I would use the API, right? I don't know what the original issue opener had in mind for this.
So you're just to flesh out your example, you're thinking you type .take range open parens 5.6 close parens, and you want that to be equivalent to skip 5 take 1.
Basically, yeah.
I mean, if you read the very first sentence of the original issue, it's like, I want to generally support what we did in C#8 on IEnumerable. So I kind of think we're changing the semantics here, or at least the intention as originally open.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you read it. Like the way I read it is basically people want the syntactic shortcut that index and range operators give you, and want this to be applied for enumerable, right? I don't think necessarily that, I don't think that means what you said, or that means what I want, right? Like it just, I think it's kind of ill-defined, if you will.
Yeah, I don't know that they want the square bracket notation, just that they want the caret and the ... notation.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, like I don't have a strong opinion. I'm just saying, based on my own usage of enumerable and what I would expect the API to do, I would personally expect take semantics, but like that doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. And all I'm saying is I think we should be clear on what the semantics are that this thing would do, and then pick a name accordingly. And it's conceivable that we end up with both take and slice because, well, depends on what you want, right? So that's another way to think about it. But I personally would probably say if we have take that just takes a range, I think it probably would address the 90 percentile.
Agreed. I should also say that the index and range types don't have any semantics hard baked into them, and I think it is wise that we use completely different names for the index and range methods precisely to highlight the fact that IEnumerable is something completely different to the iList-like types. So yeah, I would think like calling the range method take is a good idea and following the same semantics likewise.
I mean, I think it's probably also good to point out that this is really not saving you that much. So
no, it's not.
If the usage is something that half the people who use it are going to think it does something different, maybe we just don't add it.
I mean, presumably we would optimize if the underlying type is iList, then we wouldn't be doing it the expensive way.
Yeah, although like again, like the way I would use this APIs, it probably wouldn't matter. Like the 99% case for me would be I pass in collections that have less than 10 elements or something, right? So where even if you do it the super naive way, like it would be still fast enough. To me, the argument for supporting it, I think, is more to do with terseness in the usual, in the debugger and other places where space is limited. You just want quick answers, right? And I think, I guess, general orthogonality with language features. I mean, so something fundamental as ... or a caret, you probably would expect that to have wide support. So I think these are the only reason. I don't think this API would do anything that you couldn't already do, right? So.
Yep.
I mean, my other question is like, there's other overloads where that would make sense. I mean, we have 2Array, for example. It doesn't strike me as insane to say 2Array as an overload that also takes a range, right? And then this would have the normal slice semantics where you would say, well, you better have these elements in it because you would expect an array to get that size, right?
I mean, we don't have any notion of a sliced version of 2Array. It's if you wanted something smaller, then you would call, skip or take on a thing already. So I don't know that I would add a 2Array overload that took a range, because that, given that we didn't already add an offset and count type thing, it feels weird to have an overload that takes a range.
Enough. Like, yeah, to me, it's kind of like the orthogonal thing of like as span, right? Right, where you basically say, I want this thing as a span, but I want a subsection of it, right? But like we call it 2 here because, well, it's allocating clearly.
Right. I just like it. I think that I can see the value in such an overload, but I think that it becomes confusing, and if you want the hard bounded one yourself, that could easily be written.
Yeah. Someone in chat just brought up something that's been bugging me for a few minutes, which is the iQueryable implementations are going to be insanely complicated, because if the index or range that you pass in consists of only read from the front values, 2.3, whatever, those are really easy to do because you can literally rewrite them in terms of skip and take. If we start doing from the end, things get very complicated very quickly. And these APIs actually cannot be written in terms of existing APIs once you start doing from the end semantics.
If Queryable supports take last, then it's
it's not
slightly
take last,
expensive version of take last.
No, so say that you do 1.1, right? You want to skip the very first element and skip the very last element. Yep. You can't chain the final skip on top of the first skip because the count's going to be wrong.
I mean, my problem here is I don't even know how Queryable works. So like, what are these methods expected to do?
They basically get translated into Linq expressions and then passed off to something like Linq to SQL.
Right, but that would, if you had 1.1, that would be queryable.skip1.skip last one. And we have enumerable.skip last. We also have queryable.skip last. So the caret number is skip last. We were calling it take last, but it's really skip last. So this take method is return skip on a from index or skip last on a back index. So if you did caret 17 ... caret 5, that would be return skip last 17 skip last 16 skip last 0 1. There's an off by one error in negative indexes that
I did have something in mind that would potentially be a problem, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Maybe it was like caret 2 ... caret 3 or something like that. Basically, where the input values get flipped and you end up having a negative count.
Right, but that would be skip last 2, and I guess you'd need to have looked and realized that the indexes are going to have gone wrong, and then you turn that into whatever we said it would do for. You've gone too far. It looks like enumerable.skip, if you give it a negative number, it just turns it into 0 and moves on. So if it's from beginning and from end and from end, we would need to do the math before deferring to the existing things. But I think that for the most part, this can just all be, it's a 4-way table of calling skip and skip lasts. Carets end up being skip lasts, and non-carets end up being skips, and you need to figure out if you need to do offsetting, or maybe it's positive is skip and take. But yeah, like everything is expressible, I think, in terms of skip last, take, and take last.
So given that we are over time now, how about we do the simple thing for now? Let's approve element, or default, because that's clearly easy on both sides. And then let's just say for slice, we are not sure what semantics are desirable here. Like, we can either go with the take semantics, or we can go with the, you must have exactly those elements in their semantics, and then, once we have an answer to that, we can approve the other one.
And are we approving this on enumerable, queryable, or both?
Well, the element adder would approve on both because they seem unproblematic. I mean, it seems generally weird to have an API on enumerable, not on queryable, but Eric might know more. But I would think we generally would strive for having it on both sides if we can.
There is one potential downside of adding element at in queryable, and that is it could break existing query providers, because we would be adding an overload for element at where one didn't exist before. So assuming that they did a bit of reflection code that assumed that, hey, there's only one element at method, that could end up breaking the query providers. So the question is, what is the precedent when adding methods in Linq here? Because I'm not familiar with what we've been doing in the past in similar situations.
I am almost certain we approved APIs for queryable. I mean,
but have we approved going from reflection gives you a unique answer to it gives you you need to have told me the signature?
I mean,
introducing the first overload is when life gets complicated.
That's fair, but I think our general breaking bar policy for that is, that's potentially a breaking change, but one we consider acceptable, because otherwise we can't evolve our API surface. Like, we generally don't say you can't go from 0 overloads to more than 1 overload, right? Like, that's not a rule we follow. And I would think most query providers, if they want to do something sensible, like it's not that they can just blindly reflect over the type either, right? They have to know what to translate it to, right? Like, if you have to translate this stuff to SQL, like, you can't just reflect over queryable, but you have to have a table that says this operation maps to the SQL, right? And so you have to know every single operation no matter what you do. So I think, like, practically speaking, if we add new stuff to queryable, I would assume that there might be some work down level for query providers if somebody calls the API, but it's based on whether somebody uses the API, right? If nobody uses the API, it's fine. It's if somebody calls the API, that might not work anymore, but that seems, in my opinion, fine. I mean, that's just life, right?
Like when I write the reflection code, I always pass the arguments, right? Even when there's one overload, just in case. I feel like you do if you're serious.
Yeah, I mean, we say things like that, but like we've all been broken by code that didn't do that. So I'm just saying, I think we would accept this as a, yeah, you have a bug in your code, go fix it.
Yeah, the only, or when I wrote the breaking changes section and was looking at our precedent, that we adding the first overload can break reflection. We're generally okay with it, but that there then becomes some weirdness if null is allowed to be passed in, or well, default, but because generally that would be if we were simplifying a signature, but then queryable could have been special, I think is really Eric's question. I don't know the answer to that.
I think we should double check, but like I think we have approved APIs previously for queryable. I don't remember ever having had a conversation about overloads, so we should check, but I'm pretty sure we already have done that, and I think we consider that acceptable. But it wouldn't be hard to check, just see what the difference is between, let's say, .NET Framework and .NET Core Linq and Linq's queryable, and see what the discrepancy is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't know that we've ever done a partial approved before with the slice / with the thing that wants to take a system.range now move to a new issue.
Could we just mark it as needs more work, and I'll come back once we've ironed out like a final proposal for slice, including semantics?
Yeah, that would be my proposal. It's like, I would just say we are okay with the element add on both sides. We are unsure about slice, and then would it, push it back to API needs work, and then the OP can decide what to do.
Okay. I just wanted to understand our parliamentary procedure here.
One of us has to loudly yell treason at some point. I think that's requirement now.
I think you yell no confidence here in Parliament, but yeah.
All right, so let me just paste this in here, and then are folks okay with what I've written here? I should probably add the comment.
Yeah. Oh, and one more note to take while taking notes is does parallel enumerable need any of these? It looks like we have parallel enumerable element at, so I don't know if it even makes sense. I just noticed in source.net that I had 2 hits on enumerable.elem.
So in terms of the action items for the original poster here,
the T source return value on element at or default should be nullable.
Sorry, which one?
Element at or default should return T source question mark.
I don't think we can do T source question mark, right? It would be something like an attribute, right?
Yeah, I think it's attribute, maybe null, or return maybe null.
The existing element at or default method returns T source question mark.
Really?
Yeah, because it's not constrained to struct, so it like the compiler turns it into the whole attribute thing. But anyway, nullable annotations, right? It could return null.
Right.
Okay. I thought that was, yeah, I agree with Demo. I thought that was one of the places we needed an attribute because.
How do you know
int
it
would
returns
become
question
int
mark?
question.
Are you looking at the code or are you looking at APIs of .NET?
Looking at the source.
Yeah, then I don't know. Like I thought
Yeah,
that
the source.
I thought if T source is not constrained to be class, you can't use question mark. That was my.
I'm just looking at the existing code, so yeah.
Maybe it only turns it into nullable of T if it's constrained to be struct.
Yeah.
Or
otherwise, it'll emit the attribute.
so it must be doing the right thing because there's only one thing that makes sense here, which is if this is a reference type, it could be null. Answer.
Yeah, I posted in chat a link to the existing code. Anyway, nullable annotations. I know we've said we care about that.
Yes, I think that is generally a true statement. I mean, the nice thing is now that if the type is already annotated, I think you will get probably warnings if you actually add meaningful test coverage for those. So we will probably find it. So, all right. So I added a note on Linq. I added a note on the queryable breaking change with link provider thing. And so let me comment this now, and then let's just mark it as API needs work and call it a day.
Cool. It's the first part of it's approved, right?
Well, I mean,
The element
yes, I would. We probably should call this out, but like I would generally say, like if the proposal owner is okay with removing the slice method, then we can approve it. If they don't want this, then up to them.
Okay.
So what is there to be done to bring a second round of reviews for a slice-like method, or a range method rather?
So
we need to understand, I think, scenarios and semantics.
Yeah.
Okay, so working with prototypes and bringing out examples, presumably.
Because if what's wanted is take semantics, where if the range expresses where the end is before the beginning, etc., that it turns into empty, then I think that the right answer is take, and we then probably decide we're okay with it. If we want hard slicing, we need to understand what other things in enumerable look like that. And I'm still going to be wary of using the word slice because even if the language doesn't support picking it up off of extension methods now, if they did in the future, then we'd have a very long argument with the language team that we didn't want this to have been found. So I think we want to avoid the word slice no matter what. But in order to know what the best name for it is, we need to know what it's supposed to do.
Makes sense.
I also posted into chat an example of a call that is extremely complicated for queryable semantics, and we would need answers to stuff like that. I would need to put that into the GitHub issue as well, because clearly people can't see our team chat.
Yep.
Yeah, so to me, the action items is the semantics of take. It's figuring out whether we should address anything in Linq, and then making sure that we are okay with adding new members to queryable, right? And if the answer for that is no, then we can just change the proposal to only evolve enumerable. That's also fine, but I think we need answers for all three of them.
Makes sense.
All right, then I think that's all we had for today. So we reviewed one thing. All right, but like better than nothing. So then I guess I'll see you on Thursday.
See ya.
Ciao.
Bye, folks online.